the librarians here at the Hart County Library, and we're back with another episode of Trivialized Horror. Today our story is The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall. It's a story that was written by an author with one of the greatest names ever, John Kendrick Bangs. His name was so cool that a literary genre, Bangsian fantasy, was named for him. It's a genre that concerns famous literary or historical individuals and their interactions in the afterlife. The ghosts of various famous men and women come together and have various, usually genteel adventures, according to Wikipedia. Bangs didn't invent the genre, but it's named for him because he often wrote in it. He had 4 different novels from 1895 to 1901 in the Bangsian fantasy genre. The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall is not a Bangsian fantasy, but it is from his book, The Water Ghost and Others, that is considered the first American anthology consisting of only humorous ghost stories. I first read this story in a copy of this book, Alfred Hitchcock's Haunted Houseful. It's another collection of short stories from my formative years. Highly recommend it, and we'll get on with reading the story now. Okay, The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall by John Kendrick Bangs. The trouble with Harrowby Hall was that it was haunted, and what was worse, the ghost did not merely appear at the bedside of a person, but remained there for 1 mortal hour before it disappeared. It never appeared except on Christmas Eve, and then as the clock was striking 12. The owners of Harrowby Hall had tried their hardest to rid themselves of this damp and dewy lady who rose up out of the best bedroom floor at midnight, but they had failed. They had tried stopping the clock so the ghost would not know when it was midnight, but she made her appearance just the same, and there she would stand until everything about her was thoroughly soaked. Then the owners of Harrowby Hall closed up every crack in the floor with hemp, and over these were placed layers of tar and canvas. The walls were made waterproof, and the doors and windows likewise, in the hope that the lady would find it difficult to leak into the room, but even this did no good. The following Christmas Eve, she appeared as promptly as before and frightened the guest of the room quite out of his senses by sitting down beside him and gazing with her cavernous blue eyes into his. In her long bony fingers, bits of dripping seaweed were entwined, the ends hanging down, and these ends she drew across his forehead until he fainted away. He was found unconscious in his bed the next morning, simply saturated with seawater and fright. The next year, the master of Harrowby Hall decided not to have the best spare bedroom opened at all, but the ghost appeared as usual in the room. That is, it was supposed she did, for the hangings were dripping wet the next morning. Finding no one there, she immediately set out to haunt the owner of Harrowby himself. She found him in his own cozy room, congratulating himself upon having outwitted her. All of a sudden, the curl went out of his hair, and he was as wet as if he'd fallen into a rain barrel. When he saw before him the lady of the cavernous eyes and seaweed fingers, he too fainted, but immediately came to because of the vast amount of water in his hair trickling down over his face, reviving him. Now, it so happened that the master of Harrowby was a brave man. He intended to find out a few things he felt he had a right to know. He would have liked to have put on a dry suit of clothes first, but the ghost refused to leave him for an instant until her hour was up. In an effort to warm himself, he turned to the fire, but it was an unfortunate move because it brought the ghost directly over the flames, which were immediately extinguished. At this he turned angrily to her and said, "Far be it from me to be impolite to a woman, madam, but I wish you'd stop your infernal visits to this house. Go sit out on the lake if you like that sort of thing. Soak the rain barrel if you wish, but do not come into a gentleman's house and soak him and his possessions in this way. I beg of you." "Henry Hardwick Oglethorpe," said the ghost in a gurgling voice, "you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know that I am compelled to haunt this place year after year by my terrible fate. It is no pleasure for me to enter this house and ruin everything I touch. I never aspired to be a shower bath, but it is my doom. Do you know who I am?" "No, I don't," returned the master of Harrowby. "I should say you were the Lady of the Lake." "No, I am the Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall, and I have held this highly unpleasant office for 200 years tonight." "How the devil did you ever come to get elected?" asked the master. "Through a mistake," replied the specter. "I am the ghost of that fair maiden whose picture hangs over the mantelpiece in the drawing room." "But what made you get the house into such a spot?" "I am not to blame, sir," returned the lady. "It was my father's fault. He built Harrowby Hall, and the room I haunt was to have been mine. My father had it furnished in pink and yellow, knowing well that blue and gray were the only combination of colors I could bear. He did it to spite me, and I refused to live in the room. Then my father said that I could live there or on the lawn, he didn't care which. That night I ran from the house and jumped over the cliff into the sea." "Well, that was foolish," said the master of Harrowby. "So I've heard," returned the ghost. "But I really never realized what I was doing until after I was drowned. I had been drowned a week when a sea nymph came to me. She informed me that I was to be one of her followers, and that my doom was to haunt Harrowby Hall for 1 hour every Christmas Eve throughout the rest of eternity. I was to haunt that room on such Christmas Eves as I found it occupied, and if it should turn out it was not occupied, I was to spend that hour with the head of the house. I'll sell the place. That you cannot do, for then I must appear to any purchaser and reveal to him the awful secret of the house. Do you mean to tell me that on every Christmas Eve that I don't happen to have somebody in this guest chamber, you are going to haunt me wherever I may be, taking all the curl out of my hair, putting out my fire, and soaking me through to the skin? Demanded the master. Yes, Oglethorpe, and what is more, said the water ghost, it doesn't make the slightest difference where you are. If I find that room empty, wherever you may be, I shall douse you with my spectral presence. Here the clock struck 1, and immediately the ghost faded away. It was perhaps more a trickle than a fading, but as disappearances go, it was complete. By St. George and his dragon, cried the master of Harrowby, I swear that next Christmas there'll be someone in the spare room, or I'll spend the night in a bathtub. But when Christmas Eve came again, the master of Harrowby was in his grave. He never recovered from the cold he caught that awful night. Harrowby Hall was closed, and the heir to the estate was in London, and there to him in his apartment came the water ghost at the appointed hour. Being younger and stronger, however, he survived the shock. Everything in his rooms were ruined. His clocks were rusted, a fine collection of watercolor drawings was entirely washed out, and because the apartment below his were drenched with water soaking through the floors, he was asked by his landlord to leave the apartment immediately. The story of his family's ghost had gone about. No one would invite him to any party except afternoon tea and receptions, and the fathers of daughters refused to allow him to remain in their houses later than 8 o'clock at night. So the heir of Harrowby Hall determined that something must be done. The thought came to him to have the fireplace in the room enlarged so that the ghost would evaporate at its first appearance, but he remembered his father's experience with the fire. Then he thought of steam pipes. These, he remembered, could lie hundreds of feet deep in water and still be hot enough to drive the water away in vapor. So the haunted room was heated by steam to a withering degree. The scheme was only partially successful. The water ghost appeared at the specified time, but as hot as the room was, it shortened her visit by no more than 5 minutes in the hour. And during this time, the young master was a nervous wreck, and the room itself was terribly cracked and warped. And worse than this, as the last drop of the water ghost was slowly sizzling itself out on the floor, she whispered that there was still plenty of water where she came from, and that next year would find her as exasperatingly saturating as ever. It was then that, going from one extreme to the other, the heir of Harrowby hit upon the means by which the water ghost was ultimately conquered, and happiness came once more to the house of Oglethorpe. The heir provided himself with a warm suit of fur underclothing. Wearing this with the furry side in, he placed over it a tight-fitting rubber garment like a jersey. On top of this, he drew on another set of woolen underclothing, and over this was a second rubber garment like the first. Upon his head, he wore a light and comfortable diving helmet, and so clad, on the following Christmas Eve, he awaited the coming of his tormentor. It was a bitterly cold night that brought to a close this 24th day of December. The air outside was still, but the temperature was well below zero. Within, all was quiet. The servants of Harrowby Hall awaited with beating hearts the outcome of their master's campaign against his supernatural visitor. The master himself was lying on the bed in the haunted room, dressed as he had planned, and then the clock clanged out the hour of 12. There was a sudden banging of doors. A blast of cold air swept through the halls. The door leading into the haunted chamber flew open. A splash was heard, and the water ghost was seen standing at the side of the heir of Harrowby. Immediately from his clothing there streamed rivulets of water, but deep down under the various garments he was as dry and warm as he could have wished. "Ha!" said the young master of Harrowby. "I'm glad to see you." "You are the most original man I've met, if that is true," returned the ghost. "May I ask where did you get that hat?" "Certainly, madam," returned the master courteously. "It is a little portable observatory I have made for just emergencies such as this. But tell me, is it true that you are doomed to follow me about for one mortal hour, to stand where I stand, to sit where I sit?" "That is my happy fate," returned the lady. "We'll go out on the lake," said the master, starting up. "You can't get rid of me that way," returned the ghost. "The water won't swallow me up. In fact, it will just add to my present bulk." "Nevertheless," said the master, "we will go out on the lake." "But my dear sir," returned the ghost, "it is fearfully cold out there. You will be frozen hard before you've been out 10 minutes. "Oh, no, I'll not," replied the master. "I am very warmly dressed." "Come." This last in a tone of command that made the ghost ripple. And they started. They had not gone far before the water ghost showed signs of distress. "You walk too slowly," she said. "I am nearly frozen. I beg you, hurry." I should like to oblige a lady, returned the master courteously, but my clothes are rather heavy, and 100 yards an hour is about my speed. Indeed, I think we'd better sit down on this snowdrift and talk matters over. Do not do so, I beg, cried the ghost. Let us move on. I feel myself growing rigid as it is. If we stop here, I shall be frozen stiff. That, madam, said the master slowly, seating himself on an ice cake, that is why I have brought you here. We have been on this spot just 10 minutes. We have 50 more. Take your time about it, madam, but freeze. That is all I ask of you. I cannot move my right leg now, cried the ghost in despair, and my overskirt is a solid sheet of ice. Oh, good, kind Mr. Oglethorpe, light a fire and let me go free from these icy fetters. Never, madam, it cannot be. I have you at last. Alas, cried the ghost, a tear trickling down her frozen cheek. Help me, I beg. I congeal. Congeal, madam, congeal, returned Oglethorpe coldly. You have drenched me and mine for 203 years, madam. Tonight you have had your last drench. Ah, but I shall thaw out again, and then you'll see, instead of the comfortably warm, genial ghost I have been in the past, I shall be ice water, cried the lady threateningly. No, you won't either, returned Oglethorpe, for when you are frozen quite stiff, I shall send you to a cold storage warehouse, and there you shall remain an icy work of art forevermore. But warehouses burn. So they do, but this warehouse cannot burn. It is made of asbestos and surrounded by flame-proof walls, and within those walls the temperature is now and shall be 416 degrees below the 0 point, low enough to make an icicle of any flame in this world or the next, said the master with a chuckle. For the last time, I beseech you, I would go on my knees to you, Oglethorpe, if they were not already frozen. I beg of you, do not do... Here even the words froze on the water ghost's lips, and the clock struck 1. There was a momentary tremor throughout the icebound form, and the moon, coming out from behind a cloud, shone down on the rigid figure of a beautiful woman sculptured in clear, transparent ice. There stood the ghost of Harrowby Hall, conquered by the cold, a prisoner of all time. The heir of Harrowby had won at last, and today in a large storage house in London stands the frigid form of one who will never again flood the house of Oglethorpe with woe and seawater. Thanks for listening.